All right, class. What we're going to begin today is going to be the Unit 3 dedicated to the political frame. We'll deal with Chapter 9, which is the start of the political frame. And the nice thing about this is it's not only one of my favorite chapters in the book, but I think that it's one of the most concrete in terms of your understanding of what you can do within an organization in order to exert influence and exert power. I think it's also an interesting viewpoint because unlike the others, the structural that is focused on how things are put together, and the human resources frame about trying to maximize other people's efficiency, the political frame really tries to highlight from an individual point of view how you maximize your influence and your authority over the organization. And so that, I think, individualist approach is what differentiates it in terms of the frame analysis. Let's jump right in. What are we going to cover today? We're going to talk about the assumptions of the political frame, organizations as coalitions. We'll talk about how you use power in order to get decision making in the way that you want. We'll talk about authority. We'll talk about sources of power, its distribution, conflict in organizations, and the politics of getting ahead. So what you see from beginning to end is the structural frame consists of a lot of power negotiation. It deals with who's got it, who wants it, and how it's going to be exerted within an organization. But without further ado, let's get down to the assumptions. First, some assumption that's associated with the political frame is that organizations are coalitions. What we mean by coalitions is that there are forces, groups, alignments of sorts that happens that make an organization go forward. There are the people that have power that are interested in maintaining the status quo or maintaining the system as it is. They're part of the establishment and they're part of the organization in a way that they don't want to see change happen. There are also, when you think about an organization as coalition, the interesting thing is you have long-term disagreements or enduring differences among coalition members and among different sections, different alliances. And what are we warring over within the organization? What it highlights is that organizations all have certain kinds of conflicts. They all have certain kinds of power dynamics. And one of the assumptions is that we're all arguing and fighting over the allocation of scarce resources. What do I mean exactly by scarce resources? What I'm talking about whenever I say scarce resources are in a corporate organization, it's money. There's only so much salary money to be divvied up, and the way that it's split up and who makes what is a choice that's typically decided through coalitions of power, through negotiating, and through the allocation of politically driven frame motivation. Also, scarce resources doesn't just come in the form of financing and capital. Also, think about scarce resources as time. Who has to spend the most time doing what job? How much free time are you allocated to do with what you will? How much of your job is decided ahead of time in terms of what you'll be doing at any given time? A highly structured, required job has its scarce resources divided differently than one that's very open-ended, like we saw with the Google example in the previous unit when we talked about how the human resources frame puts an emphasis on letting people do their own thing and therefore being creative and hopefully getting the most out of it. Here what we see is, well, okay, Google decided to start giving these people their time to do what they want, that scarce resource. What do they look for in return? What kind of pressures do they put on you in order to get back what they've given you with their time? But scarce resources might also come together with energies. Who gets what program? Who gets what upgrade? If you want to understand about the allocation of resources, think about it this way. Typically, in any university around the country that you go to, the business department has a really nice facility. Why? Because people who get business degrees can go out and make some money and give back to the business department, and their department therefore gets upgrades a lot faster than some departments that don't have that luxury of having a built-in capital source from alumni. The stronger an alumni network of a department, a politically driven thing in which you're deciding how your department, how your focus, how your major nets students' abilities and capabilities on a marketplace, how aggressively it pursues alumni, that means that the scarce resource of the physical commodity, the building, the computers, the level of technology, the software that you're utilizing. How easy is it for a student at your university to walk onto campus at a public lab and be able to access the Adobe creative programs that they need in order to do video editing? How easy is it for you to be able to print? Here's an example of the allocation of scarce resources. Whenever I was at Central Michigan University, which is a much smaller university than the University of Nebraska, it's not a Big Ten university. It was a MAC university. It was a regional university rather than a state university that was the primary focus, as the University of Nebraska was. They still had better access for students and some capabilities in terms of printing. We printed for free. You could go to 3 different places on campus and you could print whatever you needed for class under your username and password for free. They kept track, and I think maybe if you went over 500 pages over the course of a semester, they might send you an email warning like, hey, why are you printing so much? But that was an allocation of scarce resources that had came from a negotiation that was the student body and the student collective, the council, the group, had literally advocated that we needed those things as students, and enough of the alumni who supported it made sure that we had those scarce resources. So one of the assumptions of the political frame is that all organizations, whether they're scholarly, whether they are corporate, whether they are medical, anything involves the allocation of scarce resources. Scarce insofar as there's a finite amount of them, and resources insofar as people want them. They want them allocated in a certain way. More for me, less for you, more for my area, more to support my students, or X, Y, or Z. These scarce resources make conflict a central dynamic because power is associated with those people that can get resources and those people who can allocate who's going to continue to get those resources. If I'm a person who is in an hourly wage position and there is somebody who is in an authority position above me who decides who gets what hours, that's a very difficult position to be in if that person doesn't like you, if that person doesn't want to see you succeed. There's politics to buddying up to the person who makes the schedule, because the person who makes the schedule is able to dedicate the scarce resources of the hourly wage to who makes more money and who doesn't. So goals and decisions arise from bargaining, negotiation, jockeying for position. And this bargaining and negotiation, there's always going to be winners and losers. One of the assumptions of the political frame is that there are winners and losers. We try to find ways in which everyone can have a face-saving way out to say everybody wins, but in every situation, you win a little bit more than the other person, or you lose a little bit more than the other person. And that's why there are enduring differences among coalition members, because over the course of an organization's life cycle, you can have lost or gained a lot in these jockeying for position conflicts. So organizations as coalitions explains that coalitions are there rather than pyramids. They're groups, alliances, gatherings that show that organizational goals are multiple and often conflicting because they reflect the bargaining that we talked about and have multiple players with divergent interests. If you want to understand organizations as coalitions, think about the basic nature of a coalition. If you've ever watched, heard of, or understand any of the survival game shows that are on television, things like Survivor or Big Brother, or programs that are on the big 3 networks still that show regularly, where what is an alliance? It's a group of people who have divergent interests who decide to work together to vote other people off to advance their placement in a game. Well, an organization functions very similarly to that under the operations of, or excuse me, under the assumptions of the political frame. What it means is that there's certain coalitions. One department aligns with another. One head of the organization works alongside the other. And just like we learned in the structural frame, if you were to use, remember, the whole point of this frame analysis is to be able to use multi-perspectival analysis and think about multi-layered frames. If you stack the structural frame on top of the political frame, who has a reason to be aligned with one another? Those people who are within the same structural elements that we talked about previously. The people who are at the absolute structural apex have a reason to work together and to work in conjunction with one another. Middle managers are constantly jockeying for more authority and more influence, not only over their own particular avenue, but for middle managers writ large to have more latitude to allocate the scarce resources that we're talking about. So coalitions or groups or alliances within an organization, within a structure, that show how sets of people make decisions. Because ultimately what the political frame is interested in is, how does an organization make decisions? How do you exert your will or influence over those decisions? And I think that it does a really nice job of highlighting how every organization, no matter seemingly how benign, is making these sorts of choices all the time. So power and decision making works like this. There are certain people who have authority that make binding decisions and have social control. They have a vested interest in maintaining that authority because their position depends on it. And there are those who have authority brought down upon them. There are people who are ruled over who have to either support or question that authority. They're the ones that represent the mob. There are opinion leaders, there are people who are in control, and there are the people who follow or don't follow. An interesting analogy is something that my wife and I have always enjoyed. If you ever watched The Challenge on MTV, you can relate to, there are a few different characters who are on The Challenge who represent authorities, voices who speak as agents of social control. From Johnny DiLastanzo or whatever his name is, they call Johnny Bananas, one of the older characters. Wes, and I could go on and so forth, so on and so forth. There are also female opinion leaders, and what they do is they try to organize those same alliance mentality that we talked about on the previous slide, but they also have an authority that they have to constantly try to get you to depend on, that they're making the right choices, that they're making smart decisions, and the people that are in the game who are not yet elevated to the position of authority, they're trying to decide who to follow and who not to follow. In a corporate world, it mirrors that same jockeying for position to say that, let's say that you were going to be a new professor at a college or university. You got onto campus within your department. I remember there famously, I'll leave their name out, but everyone talked about this place was like a snake pit. You had senior faculty, and it's obviously not Henderson State, but it's somewhere else that we all talked about when we were grad students. It has senior faculty members who don't like one another, who are at odds with one another, not only in terms of their research, but their enduring differences between each other have created a hostile environment where new faculty members literally needed to pick a side. You were either going to be on Team Jacob or Team whatever the other guy is named. So I cutely hearken to the Twilight analogy to tell you that you pick a team and you stick with it. And that's how a position of authority can work in terms of the political frame for understanding power. Your support of a hegemon or a leader or a rallying point, a standard bearer, somebody who you can get behind and can then say that their victories are our victories, are a way to gain political clout. When they succeed, they bring along the people who come with them. So there's different sources of power. If we're going to constantly talk about power in the political frame, we've got to start to understand, what exactly are we talking about when we say power? There's obviously positions of power, people who make decisions and people who don't. But what do positions of power allow you to do? They allow you certain certain capabilities that are listed here. One of them is the control of rewards. So I mentioned earlier the manager who gets to allocate how many hours you get in an hourly position, but there's also who gets vacation time, who gets bonuses and doesn't, who's eligible for wage increases at their yearly performance review. Contradict these positive affect rewards with negativity. Positions of power also come with coercive power. Do this or you're fired. The threat of having your position taken away, the threat of demotion or outright termination is also a way to be able to exert force or influence. If, say, for example, in an academic setting, you've got a principal who is able to say to you, look, if you don't stop being such a disruption in class, then we're going to expel you. That coercive power tries to manipulate you into taking different actions. Coercive power is different than collaborative power. It's not one in which you agree to, it's one that is a force without actually being physical force. Coercion can obviously be physical, but in the organizational sense that we're talking about, it's a derivative of a position of power, or it's derivative of the authority to be able to influence your day-to-day life. In a military setting, it might be somebody who gets to decide where you're stationed or where you're deployed or what job that you do. In traditional popular culture representations of the military that I don't think are extremely accurate, but an easy touchstone to understand this, it's who gives you the duty that you have to do, where I think of people peeling potatoes or cleaning pots and pans or doing jobs that people generally don't want to do. A coercive power is if you make me angry, I make you do stuff you don't want to do. Also, information and expertise are a source of power. If you work in an office setting in your entire life, I can guarantee that regardless of who's the department head, who's in charge, anything like that, one of the most powerful people will be the administrative assistant slash secretary, whatever language they use to describe the person who works primarily as the office aide. They know where everything is. They know how everything works. They've dealt with the problems that you're dealing with before, and that myriad of information and expertise makes them powerful. They don't need structural legitimacy like we talked about before in the human resources frame. Theirs comes from an earned legitimacy that comes from the fact that they know how to do stuff you don't know how to do, and you might also have an expertise at completing assignments, at completing a specific area of research, at doing things that others don't have. Reputation is its own kind of power. Senior or capable faculty members call the shots on what they want to do with their classes a lot. I was very lucky that I have worked with some people within communication studies that when they wanted to have something published, they were able to, just by the virtue of having their name on it, have a pretty good shot of getting that into publication because they are an influential voice in the community with which they represent. Reputation also goes a long way whenever you think about a much smaller business entity. I just decided we're moving. We're in the course of moving right now. I decided based on Google, Yelp, and Angie's List reviews what moving company to go with. And that moving company had built a reputation through customer reviews that I read through, and I said, well, if that many people were satisfied with their service, then I'm going to choose to pay a little bit more to that moving company to move me than just some guys moving, because their reputation spoke for itself in terms of professionalism, of care and maintenance of our precious belongings that we don't want broken. You also have your alliances and your networks and the access to control the agenda. Whenever I talk about alliances and networks, it's everything that we've just talked about. Being plugged into the group that has control right now, being it's not appointed, selected, whatever process that you attribute to the fraternity or sorority on campus has the most social clout, is access to a network that is not only social in its nature, but powerful in terms of getting you in with the right crowd and getting you in with the right people who can hopefully put you in a successful position to achieve the kind of popularity, notoriety, congruity with social expectations on a campus that you'd like to be a part of. Also, access and control to the agenda. Who decides what we talk about in meetings? Who decides when we're going to meet, where we're going to meet, and how that meeting is going to take place? That's a power unto itself. It speaks to the idea that there's somebody who set the agenda, literally wrote on the sheet of paper the bullet points of what we're going to discuss. In every selection of what we're going to discuss, there was 20, 30, 50, 100 other things we could have talked about that we didn't in exchange for this particular item. The person who controls that is very powerful unto themselves. So when we talk about all these different situations of where you get power, so think about a system, an organization as a system. There's overbounded and underbounded controls. They're basically polar opposites. One has strong top-down control and is tightly regulated. The other has a weak authority that's got chaotic decision-making, open conflict, and power struggles. An overbounded system is totalitarian in its nature. It's dictatorial. If you use the language of the human resources frame, it's more autocratic on that spectrum that we learned about, compared with the underbounded system in which things are a bit more chaotic, there's more struggle for control. That's similar to what I described with the laissez-faire style of leadership. So you can draw that parallel between the two frames. So again, if you were looking for that multi-perspectival approach allowed for by the frames, you can stack the concepts from the human resources frame right on top of the power distribution of the political frame, and start to see how two different systems within an organization provide you opportunity for success or failure to acquire more power or to be able to acquire more influence on the basis of how they're run from the top down. Notice that conflict is central to almost everything we talk about in the political frame. It's highlighted by the struggles for power, by the connection of coalitions and alliances and groups and gatherings. The political frame does not see conflict as a problem at all. It's natural, it's inevitable, it's the way that we're going to decide those scarce resources. Whenever it comes down to somebody's bottom line, their dollar, their time, their energy, the amount of positives that they take out of an organization, they're going to fight for that. They're going to struggle. And there's going to be interpersonal conflict. There's going to be structural conflict. There's going to be outright argumentative conflict. And the political frame harnesses all of those to say that there are organizational conflicts that deal with who's going to be in control, who within my group gets to do what and why, and also what kind of organization are we going to be. When I talk about what kind of organization we're going to be, that's the form of organizational conflict that is often looked over. But sometimes it's something as simple as understanding that we've just had a scandal of some sort happen within our organization. How do we handle it? What are the steps that we're going to take? Are we going to be proactive? Are we going to try to cover it up to protect our own? Is our culture one that is insulary and protective of our own members and will fight to defend them no matter what? Do we seek transparency? Do we look to be able to have the truth speak for itself and open up our doors to whomever is investigating said controversy? That's a conflict of culture. That's an idea that within an organization you make decisions about how you want to be represented, how you want to be presented, and what matters to you. Remember that culture is a decision-making process about what are your ethics, what are your morals, what are the things that matter to you as an organization, as a group. Does one coalition within the group see the future of the organization as radically different than the other one? Well, that's one way that alliances can be built, and that's one way that the distribution of power in a hierarchical sense can start to become clear. There are people who want to follow, if you ever watch, I guess if you watch it, you probably missed some of this, but if you've read the books from the Game of Thrones series, and you've read A Song of Fire and Ice and all the books that are associated with it, One of the things that you've got is people who are looking to see the Targaryen dynasty resurrected and Daenerys on the Iron Throne. You have another group who think that maybe it would be better if the Lannisters are in control. Maybe it would be better if someone else entirely was in control, who is from one of the smaller families. What you're seeing is a hierarchical conflict. It's one of the biggest and highest grossing pop culture dramas that's currently on TV. It makes national news every time a new episode airs on HBO, and it's all about a political conflict. Well, organizations do that exact same thing. They figure out through organizational conflict who's going to be in control, who's going to call the shots, and why they get to do that in the way that they do. So, if all these things about conflict occur in a political setting, you're going to hit certain morality mazes. It's the politics of getting ahead. If I am only worried about my influence and my power, what kind of ruthless decisions am I willing to make? How willing am I to sacrifice my ethics? Do we have a very cutthroat culture? And are we in an organization in which anything goes? And as long as I'm successful, I don't really care what happens to the people around me? You have to understand that organizations can't eliminate politics, but they can influence the kind of politics that they have. From a human resource perspective, attributed to this political perspective, you want to have leaders and people who are in control who keep it classy, San Diego. They keep it clean between the rival coalitions. They keep people from being too disastrously cruel to one another, to doing things that destabilize the organization as a whole. I'll give you one example from a grad school that I never attended, but that I heard from many of my friends who did go to that particular grad school. It was so cutthroat and they had such a devastating culture there that the moral mazes were such that when they found the right answers to quizzes and things, they would rip pages out of books in the library so that other people couldn't get the right answer that they had. They would try to check out books and keep them for long periods of time so that other people couldn't get access to the material that they needed. They would do anything that they could to get ahead, and it created a really toxic environment where a lot of people were not able to succeed. That's an organizational culture issue that deals with politics. Coalitions, groups came together and said that they didn't want that to keep happening, so they became a self-policing coalition that said that when they caught somebody doing that, that person was ostracized socially, which, remember, reputation is a form of power, and through that moral maze they were trying to influence as a group a behavioral norm. Hey, don't cheat and don't make it harder for all of us to learn. And that is a way that politics can be regulated in some capacity, even within a competitive organization. So what did we talk about today? We talked about the assumptions of the political frame, and I think we did a really good job laying the groundwork. We're going to look at case studies moving forward. We're going to look at the application of the political frame, and we're going to look at strategies that you can personally use in order to try to get ahead in the methodology of power and conflict that the political frame really puts forward. So, though politics can be nasty and brutish, there are constructive politics, and I hope that you see that they're necessary for organizations to be effective, because every organization has scarce resources. They have to be allocated, and the decision-making process is going to require a little bit of elbowing, a little bit of jockeying for position, but that doesn't necessarily mean it needs to be nasty and ugly. It just means that it needs to happen. So if I were going to do response papers for this particular chapter, I would, one, test any of the positions of power or the forms of power. I would, secondly, see if I could include a form of power that just isn't there within an organization. Is there a glaring omission that you know of that you'd like to share with the group so that we might think critically about that particular potential area of power for ourselves? I'd like you to potentially talk about any coalitions that you've been a part of within an organization or have had an influence over you. What did they do? How did they work? How were they effective? Were they ineffective? Did they not fulfill the goal that they were looking to achieve? That could be an interesting topic of discourse. I also would like you to talk about pro-social or constructive methods of conflict in which you have witnessed, been a part of, that aided an organization in moving forward. Those would all be very interesting response papers. If you have any questions, as always, I encourage you to email me. I'm starting to read some of the response papers now, and I'm interested not only in what you've been saying, but I appreciate the replies. A lot of you have been quite thoughtful in the things that you've been saying, and I think that we're coming along nicely after the small hiccup in the beginning. Keep up the good work, everyone, and if you need any further implication, if you need any further exposition on any of the given topics that we cover, don't hesitate to reach out to me and I'll do my best to be able to help you. Hope you're enjoying this as much as I can, and I look forward to talking to you about Chapter 10.